Joe had been working the same farm quietly for 30 years. It seemed like just another normal day, until drug cartel members chose the wrong land and learned exactly who the old farmer really was. Welcome to the Hidden Stories. Before we begin this intense story of hidden courage and deadly skills, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Joe Thompson stood on his front porch at 5:30 a.m., coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over 240 acres of Nebraska farmland he'd called home for 3 decades. At 67, his weathered hands and sun-darkened skin told the story of a man who'd worked every day of his adult life. The corn was coming in well this season. The cattle looked healthy. His small farmhouse sat exactly where his grandfather had built it in 1952. Simple, sturdy, unpretentious. This was the kind of peace Joe had dreamed about for years before he'd finally found it. "Morning, Buster," he said to the old German shepherd that appeared at his side. The dog was 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, but still alert, still protective. Joe finished his coffee and walked toward the barn. Another day of work ahead, fixing fence posts, checking irrigation lines, preparing for harvest. The same routine he'd followed for 30 years, ever since he'd bought this place and decided to disappear into the quiet life of farming. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. The county sheriff drove by maybe once a month. The most exciting thing that happened in Millfield County was the annual corn festival. Joe liked it that way. As he cranked up his old John Deere tractor, Joe noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon. Someone was driving fast down the dirt road that led to his property. That was unusual. Most folks around here drove slow, respected the rural pace of life. Joe kept working, but something in the back of his mind stirred, an awareness he hadn't felt in years. 3 black SUVs pulled into Joe's driveway at exactly 10:15 a.m. The vehicles were expensive, out of place, with tinted windows and license plates Joe didn't recognize. 6 men got out, all wearing similar dark clothing and moving with a coordination that set off every alarm bell Joe had spent 30 years trying to silence. Joe shut off his tractor and walked slowly toward the vehicles, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Buster followed, but Joe noticed the dog's hackles were raised. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Joe called out, his voice carrying the easy drawl of a man who'd lived in farm country for decades. The leader of the group stepped forward. Mid-30s, expensive sunglasses, gold chains visible under his shirt. He looked around Joe's property with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating real estate. "You Joe Thompson?" "That's right. This is my land. What can I do for you?" "My name is Carlos. We represent certain business interests. We need to use your property for a few days." Joe's expression didn't change, but his mind was suddenly running tactical assessments he hadn't used in 3 decades. 6 men, probably armed, positioning themselves with sightlines across his property. This wasn't a casual visit. "What kind of business?" Carlos smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "The kind where we pay you well to ask no questions and stay in your house for the next week." "And if I'm not interested?" "Old man, you don't really have a choice." That's when Joe noticed the bulges under their jackets, the way they positioned themselves in a defensive formation, the radio communications equipment visible in their vehicles. These weren't local troublemakers. These were professionals, and they'd just made a very serious mistake. "Gentlemen," Joe said calmly, "I think you've got the wrong property. I'm just a farmer. I grow corn and raise cattle. This isn't the kind of place for whatever business you're conducting." Carlos laughed. "Actually, it's perfect. Remote location, no neighbors, good sightlines for security. Your farm is exactly what we need for our operation." "What operation?" "Let's just say we're expecting some deliveries, private deliveries, and we need a place where helicopters can land without attracting attention." Joe's blood ran cold. Drug trafficking. These men were planning to use his land as a distribution point for cartel operations. Everything he'd built here, the peace he'd found, was about to be destroyed. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," Joe said quietly. Carlos's smile disappeared. "Old man, you seem to be confused about how this works. We're not asking permission." Two of his men moved closer to Joe, hands moving toward their weapons. But Joe noticed something they hadn't: his positioning near the barn, the angle of the sun creating shadows, Buster moving quietly to his left flank. Son, Joe said, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge. I've spent 30 years on this farm living peaceful. But before that, I spent 20 years making sure peace was possible for folks like you and me. Carlos frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means you picked the wrong farm. Joe's transformation was subtle but complete. His posture straightened slightly, his eyes sharpened, and his hands moved with sudden purpose. 30 years of carefully maintained civilian life began dissolving like morning mist. Who the hell are you, old man? Master Sergeant Joe Thompson, United States Army Special Forces, 1st Special Forces Group, retired 1994. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos stared at Joe like he was seeing him for the first time. Special Forces? You're bluffing. 3 tours in Central America, 2 in the Middle East, specialized in counterinsurgency operations and drug interdiction. Spent most of the 80s making sure people like you stayed out of places like this. Joe's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. The transformation was remarkable. The humble farmer had vanished, replaced by someone these men instinctively recognized as dangerous. That was 30 years ago, old man. You're 67 years old. Age doesn't erase training, Carlos. It just makes you more selective about when to use it. One of Carlos's men whispered something in Spanish. Joe understood every word. They were discussing whether to eliminate the threat immediately or try to intimidate him into compliance. Here's what's going to happen, Carlos said, pulling his weapon. You're going to go inside your house and stay there while we conduct our business. Any trouble from you, and this becomes a very different kind of conversation. Joe looked at the 6 armed men positioned around his property and made his calculation. Multiple hostiles, good cover near the barn, Buster trained for combat support, extensive knowledge of the terrain. Carlos, I'm going to give you one chance to get back in those vehicles and leave my property. Take it. Carlos laughed. Or what? You're going to fight all 6 of us? Joe's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who'd calculated odds in much worse situations. I'm not going to fight you, son. I'm going to stop you. That's when Master Sergeant Joe Thompson came out of retirement. What happened next would be talked about in Millfield County for decades. Joe moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body remembered 20 years of special operations training. His first target was the man closest to him, a clean disarm and takedown that left the gunman unconscious before his weapon hit the ground. Buster, responding to hand signals Joe had practiced for 12 years, flanked left and took down the second man with the trained aggression of a military working dog. Carlos spun toward the commotion, weapon raised, but Joe was already moving. Using the barn corner for cover, he acquired Carlos's position and neutralized him with a precision strike that left him gasping on the ground. The remaining 3 men opened fire, but Joe was no longer where they expected him to be. Years of guerrilla warfare training guided his movements as he used cover and concealment to close distance while avoiding their shots. The 4th man went down to a flanking maneuver Joe had learned in El Salvador. The 5th fell to a tactical approach that combined speed, surprise, and 30 years of suppressed muscle memory. The last gunman, panicking, attempted to retreat to the vehicles. Joe's pursuit was methodical, professional, inevitable. The engagement ended with 6 armed criminals neutralized and 1 old farmer standing over them with the calm satisfaction of a job well done. Total elapsed time, 32 seconds. Joe stood in his farmyard, surrounded by 6 defeated cartel members, breathing normally despite having just engaged in the first combat action of his retirement. Buster sat at his side, alert but calm, waiting for the next command. Well, Joe said to himself, that's going to require some explanation. He secured the weapons and used zip ties from his workshop to restrain the 6 men. His movements were efficient, automatic, the same post-engagement protocols he'd followed hundreds of times during his military career. Carlos, conscious but dazed, stared up at Joe with new understanding. You weren't bluffing. Son, I spent 20 years dealing with people exactly like you in countries exactly like the ones you come from. The only difference between then and now is that this time, it's personal. This is my land. Joe pulled out his cell phone, an old flip phone he'd owned for years, and dialed a number he hadn't used in decades. Federal Drug Enforcement Agency. How can I help you? This is Master Sergeant Joe Thompson, retired Special Forces. I have 6 suspected cartel members detained on my property in Millfield County, Nebraska. I need immediate federal response. The agent on the other end paused. Sir, can you repeat that? 6 suspects, probably here to establish a drug distribution point. All secured, no casualties, weapons confiscated. I'll be waiting. Joe gave his coordinates and hung up. Carlos struggled against his restraints. You have no idea who you're messing with, old man. My organization doesn't forget. Joe knelt down beside him, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone who'd faced much worse threats than drug cartels. Carlos, your organization is about to learn something important. This farm is off limits, permanently, and if any of your associates decide to test that boundary, they're going to discover that some soldiers never really retire. The FBI arrived first, followed by DEA agents and the county sheriff. By noon, Joe's quiet farm had become a federal crime scene, with helicopters overhead and agents swarming across his property. Special Agent Sarah Chen, DEA, approached Joe as he sat on his porch with Buster, both watching the organized chaos with mild interest. Mr. Thompson? I'm Agent Chen. I understand you apprehended 6 suspects single-handedly. 6 men made an unauthorized entry onto my property and threatened me with weapons. I defended myself. Agent Chen looked at the tactical precision of the scene, weapons secured in proper evidence formation, suspects properly restrained, no collateral damage to property. Sir, your military record shows extensive special operations experience, 20 years active duty, multiple combat deployments, specialized training in counter-drug operations. That's correct. Can you walk me through what happened here? Joe gave a factual, concise report that impressed every federal agent present. No embellishment, no heroics, just professional documentation of a threat engagement and neutralization. Mr. Thompson, these men are connected to a major cartel operation we've been tracking for months. They were planning to establish a distribution hub in your area. They picked the wrong farm, Agent Chen smiled. Yes, sir, they certainly did. Can I ask why you retired to farming? Joe looked across his property, the cornfields he'd tended for 30 years, the cattle grazing peacefully, the simple life he'd built here. Agent Chen, I spent 20 years fighting wars in other people's countries. When I retired, I wanted to grow things instead of destroying them. This farm represents everything I fought to protect. And when that peace was threatened, peace isn't free, Agent. Someone always has to be willing to defend it. The federal investigation revealed that the cartel had been planning to use Joe's farm as part of a major drug pipeline. His actions had disrupted an operation worth millions of dollars and led to arrests across 3 states. But Joe refused all interviews, declined commendations, and asked only that his privacy be respected. 3 weeks later, Joe was back to his normal routine. The federal agents were gone, the crime scene tape had been removed, and his farm looked exactly like it had for 30 years. Except for one small change. Sheriff Martinez stopped by on his monthly patrol, something he'd been doing for years. But this time, he approached Joe with new respect. Joe, I wanted to thank you. That cartel operation would have brought nothing but trouble to our county. Joe was repairing a fence post, the same work he'd been doing for decades. Just protecting my property, Sheriff. The DEA agent said you handled 6 armed men like it was nothing. Wasn't nothing, was necessary. Sheriff Martinez nodded. Can I ask you something? In all the years I've known you, you never mentioned military service. Joe set down his post-hole digger and looked at the sheriff. Sheriff, some folks serve and then spend the rest of their lives talking about it. Others serve and then spend the rest of their lives trying to forget it. I'm the second kind. But when the time came, you remembered everything. Muscle memory doesn't fade. Training doesn't disappear. You just hope you never need it again. A month later, word had spread quietly through the farming community about what had happened at Joe's place, but nobody treated him differently. Farmers understood that everyone had a past, and what mattered was how you treated your neighbors and your land. Joe was loading feed when his neighbor Bill stopped by. "Joe, heard you had some excitement a few weeks back." "Little bit. Everything okay now?" "Everything's fine, Bill. Thanks for asking." That was the extent of their conversation about it. Rural people respected privacy and understood that some stories didn't need telling. But there was one change Joe noticed. The drug activity that had been increasing in surrounding counties suddenly stopped. Word had apparently spread through certain communities that Millfield County was off limits. Joe never asked for confirmation, but he suspected that his message had been received and understood. 6 months later, Joe received an unexpected visitor. A young man in his 20s, wearing army fatigues and sporting the distinctive green beret of Special Forces. "Sir, are you Master Sergeant Thompson?" "I'm Joe Thompson. What can I do for you, son?" "Sir, I'm Staff Sergeant Martinez, 5th Special Forces Group. My unit commander said I should meet you." Joe studied the young soldier. "Your commander have a name?" "Colonel Patterson, sir. He said you served together in Central America." Joe's expression softened slightly. "Dave Patterson? How's he doing?" "Good, sir. He told me to tell you that the old-timers still remember how to handle business." Joe smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. Dave always did have a sense of humor. "What brings you to Nebraska, Staff Sergeant?" "I'm transitioning out next year, sir. Looking for a place to settle down. Colonel Patterson said you'd found peace out here." Joe looked around his property, the corn ready for harvest, cattle grazing contentedly, the simple life he'd built and successfully defended. "Staff Sergeant, peace isn't something you find. It's something you create, and sometimes it's something you have to fight for." "Yes, sir. I understand that now." "You looking for work?" "Yes, sir. Willing to learn any trade." Joe nodded toward his fields. "Farming's honest work, hard work, quiet work, but it grows things instead of destroying them." "I'd like that, sir." "Then stick around. Harvest season's coming, and I could use help." As the young soldier walked toward the guest quarters Joe maintained for seasonal workers, Buster appeared at Joe's side. "What do you think, old boy? Think he'll take to farming?" Buster wagged his tail once. Joe looked across his land, 30 years of peace, defended successfully, now being passed on to the next generation of warriors, learning to grow instead of fight. Some battles end when you win them. Others end when you teach someone else to fight them. Joe Thompson had done both. This story was brought to you by The Hidden Stories. If you know someone whose service continues in unexpected ways, share their story in the comments and subscribe to honor those who defend what matters, whether in uniform or overalls.